Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, I'm Rick Herman. I'm the director here at the Mershon Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this conference. Clearly, being the director of Mershon, the best part of it is you get to interlope on meetings like this one that your colleagues have organized, and I've enjoyed that for a lot of years, so it's been great. I'm hopeful that next few weeks a new director will be named by the executive dean, but I love this as my swan song, if that's what it is. It's been a great time, and conferences like this one are really the highlight. This one actually started the year I became the director in 2001. The first election study conference was of the 2000 election, put together by Herb Weisberg, and we were just talking, this is the fifth one. It's been a tremendously successful run for the center, as Herb and now Tom Wood have brought together terrific people to analyze the elections about a year or so after they've occurred. For those of you who don't know much about Mershon, it's a center that studies international security affairs endowed by Ralph Mershon. He was an inventor, a contemporary of Thomas Edison. He invented the first electronic condensers, and he left his fortune to Ohio State in 1954. With the proviso that the resources that his gift generated would be spent by civilians studying issues of military affairs and national security. And the center, as it's currently constructed, was formed in 1967 and has been doing, hopefully, that job ever since. So most of the work of the center focuses on activities outside the United States. But this one, where we look at elections, and we have a very large comparative national election project that looks at democratization and the management of violent conflict all over the world. This particular series of conferences has tended to focus on the United States and the presidential elections here, also the national security side of the presidential elections here. Obviously, this last election was a complex one and had outcomes that surprised lots of people. It raised many national security questions, America first being a huge theme, along with a populist sense that the United States' role in the global order ought to change, attacks directly on globalism as a defining principle that people thought was wrong, and the like. So I'm very glad that we have this. I'm going to turn the floor quickly over to, well, I want to thank my staff, Stephen Blaylock, I don't see him, there he is, and Kyle McRae. If you have questions or need any logistic support, Stephen is terrific, and I recommend you take his advice. He'll know better than me. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom Wood, my colleague from political science.
Okay. First off, I apologize. I imagine it's jarring to listen to an Australian talk about American elections. But if my students have to suffer through it, I don't think you all are that special. So first, on behalf of Herb and myself, I'd like to thank the Mershon Center as well, who provided the necessary financial and institutional support to bring folks from across the country to be with us today. The Mershon Center is a generous and reliable sponsor of American politics research here at Ohio State. And I specifically want to thank the leadership provided by Rick Herman as the interim director and Jan Box-Steffensmeyer. I speak on behalf of everybody at OSU to emphasize our gratitude for the leadership that Rick and Jan provide. So that's very important. Their leadership is the sort of thing that makes conferences like this possible. I next have to recognize the people who traveled from across the United States to Columbus on a dreary old day in November. I'm in the middle of their fall teaching obligations. In programmatic order, Wendy, Rahn, and Lavine are here from the University of Minnesota. John Sides is here from George Washington University. Dan Hopkins is also here, is from the University of Pennsylvania. Eric Oliver is here from the University of Chicago. Dinah Mutz is here from the University of Pennsylvania. Ethan Porter is here from George Washington University. Bill Jacoby will be coming here from Michigan State. And Walter Borges is here from the University of North Texas, Dallas. Thank you all for being so generous with your time and coming to share what we're certain will be a great set of papers. Well, the papers I know are great. I'm certain the presentations will also be fantastic. We're also very fortunate to receive presentations from people here at Ohio State. Chris Gelpi and Elias Assaf are respectively faculty and a graduate student in the Department of Political Science. Kelly Garrett and Eric Nisbet are faculty in the Communications Department. Richard Gunther and Paul Becker at the Mershon Center, and also emeritus faculty in Political Science. Many OSU faculty will also serve as discussants today. Paul Beck, Herb Asher, Nathaniel Swigger, and Anthony Mugen are all in political science, have very generously agreed to serve in this capacity. Now, it's difficult to convey to a layperson just how distinguished a group of American politics scholars have gathered today. Many people in this room spent decades at the forefront of American politics research and have written exceptional papers. And for those of my students who have come this morning, these are now the faces that you've been forced to read all semester. Now, for all those who teach about elections or who write for a popular audience, this is a very familiar dilemma. There's an endless appetite in the popular discussion to talk about elections as being novel and unique, to emphasize the unprecedented, the unexpected. Our vocation impels us in the directly opposite direction. We emphasize stability and unpredictability, claim that the idiosyncrasies of a race are tiny compared to the effect of economic and political structure. In 2016, those who asserted stability were initially humbled by a highly unusual Republican nominee, a very unusual GOP nomination process, an eventual presidential candidate who flouted, like speaking in a way to comport with social expectations, an historical mismatch in the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. Should we conclude that 2016 marks a political inflection point, or was the 16 race far more conventional than it might otherwise appear? These are among the questions we hope to address today. Herb, thank you.
And I may or may not need help getting going on PowerPoint here, because I'm definitely not an IBM person. I don't know where to start. It's that simple. Just start the show.
And you can use a clicker if you want to go back and forth.
Good.
Yep, or the arrows.
Good. Okay. Well, again, thanks for coming here for the conference. U.S. national security is certainly based on U.S. domestic security and U.S. domestic democracy and its health. And that makes it important to understand the 2016 election, and for that matter, its aftermath. Thanks for the visitors for coming to the conference. And again, thanks for Mershon, Rick Herman, Steve Blaylock, Kyle, and everybody else who's really helped put it together. We've got a fascinating set of papers that provide a lot of perspectives on the election. We're hoping that paper givers can hold it to 12 to 18 minutes and the discussions to 5 minutes, and that panel chairs make sure that there's enough time for discussion from the audience, which is always the most fun part of these conferences. While the papers provide a few perspectives on the election, I realized going through them that one perspective was missing, and that's have Kathy Kramer in her book, The Politics of Resentment. If you haven't read the book, I would certainly recommend that book in terms of insights on the election, even though it's written well before it, along with the book by our own J.D. Vance on Hillbilly Elegy for a different set of perspectives, again, written before the election, but quite relevant. But I'm going to end up channeling Kathy Kramer, giving perspectives. She talked to actual voters discussing politics, and I unexpectedly found that I was being asked to be a political expert in a tour of Ohio just before the election. The company was politicotours.com. They travel around the world showing people the politics, interviewing people, meeting participants. Earlier in the year, they had gone to North Korea and Iran to learn about their politics, so we were a natural site to... You got it. The tour group that I was on included 7 Brits, 4 Aussies, and 1 Kiwi. The company was, the owner of the company, Nicholas Wood, I don't think any relation, is a British ex-journalist. The highlight was going to the Mahoning Valley area. If you're not sure where we are, it's Franklin County in the center of the state, and the Mahoning Valley is up in the top right corner, bordering Pennsylvania. And we had a chance to interact with a lot of voters there. Mahoning is where Youngstown is itself, that county, but it's the counties around there. And I'm going to focus in on 3 counties. Trumbull, just north of Mahoning, is where it has not voted Republican since voting for Nixon's reelection in 1972. Similarly, Mahoning, where Youngstown is, whereas Columbiana, just south of there, is a more agricultural county. And that's where we started. It's gone back and forth politically over the years. The person sitting with the jacket on the left is the tour guide, Nicholas Wood, whose company it was. But we started off talking to a farm group in Columbiana County one afternoon. Most of the people that he assembled there were planning to vote for Trump. They certainly did not approve of his morals, but they certainly respected Pence a lot. But they didn't trust Clinton. That became very clear. They were very concerned about an activist Supreme Court, particularly on the abortion issue. They saw bureaucrats as the problem. One fellow became very agitated, scaringly agitated, as he spoke about his Second Amendment rights, the original American Revolution, making it quite clear he was quite ready to use his guns if necessary for another revolution to take back his country and his government. Well, the next morning we drove into Youngstown, drove down Wilson Avenue to see the closed steel mills. Besides the closed steel mills, Youngstown is best known for its former Congressman Jim Traficant, his speeches on the House floor, which usually ended by saying, "Beam me up, Scotty." He was eventually convicted of racketeering, which isn't unusual in Youngstown because most everybody's had some mob connection. The current member of Congress from there is Tim Ryan, who's the one who tried challenging Nancy Pelosi's Democratic minority leader for this Congress. So that morning, we ended up at a diner in Youngstown, and the tour leader quickly pulled over patrons to our tables to talk about their views on the election. Some were pro-Trump, most were pro-Trump, a few pro-Clinton. Their children were leaving the area. They couldn't get jobs there. One diner grabbed me, telling me how mad he was that the government had bailed out General Motors, but hadn't bailed out the steel industry. I checked back afterwards. The Youngstown Steel Company went out of business in 1977. Jimmy Carter had been asked for government loan guarantees to keep the steel mills open, and he refused them. People there have a long memory. That afternoon, the foreigners, as the radio show host called them, ended up on a talk radio show in the Youngstown area. And the host, jokingly asked them their perceptions of the election and so on. When it was time for questions from the audience, the switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree. Calls from irate listeners. They wanted immigration stopped. It's our country. They didn't want a flood of immigrants. They were mad about American jobs moving to China and Vietnam. Well, these are the people who elected Trump. Trumbull County, just north of Youngstown, had been voting Democrats since starting 76 onward. Trump narrowly won. Moved down to Mahoning, where Youngstown is, again Democrat ever since Nixon's reelection. Clinton won, but very narrowly, very narrowly. And then Columbiana, that agricultural county just south of there, has been going Republican last few elections. Before that it was back and forth, but Trump won handily, just with the landslide. To give a perspective on the vote, each of these counties moved about 12-13% in the Republican direction since 2012 in voting for Trump. However, the fall-off on the Democratic side was a few points steeper throughout. Clinton wasn't very popular, and that became evident, even though there might have been some hesitation, this suggests, in terms of switching over and voting for Trump. This is some of the road signs that we saw on the tour, which suggests how unpopular Clinton was in the area. Hillary for prison, if you see there. They were against Clinton, perhaps because of gender, more likely because she was seen as likely to keep making the type of changes they didn't like, and also because they've been hearing negative things about her in the media for a quarter century, and they just didn't trust her at all. And the email server, the Comey's intervention, just reminded them further of why they weren't trusting her. Kathy Kramer entitled her book The Politics of Resentment, and the subtitle included the term rural consciousness. I don't think it was rural consciousness quite that we're seeing. These were really industrial counties at one point. Small city consciousness, maybe. Rust Belt resentment, certainly some of that they really wanted their jobs back. Economic distress, yes. And certainly Trump stoked the resentment of these voters, and he got a high proportion of the vote in places like these. Was it racial resentment? Race never came up in the discussions there. Like Kathy Kramer and her Wisconsin voters and her interpretation of that, the voters we met were not focused on race. They were focused on what they weren't getting and what their kids won't be getting. They might have scored high on one of our racial resentment scales, but what they really resented was that there aren't jobs there for their kids and that their own jobs aren't paying the kind of money they did when they were steel mills there. They didn't care much about what blacks were getting. They cared a lot more about what their own families weren't getting. As I thought about it more afterwards, I reflected on all the changes in the Obama years. Certainly foreign policy, and we could mention just about any part of the world, but also the speed of change on the domestic scene in the 8 years of the Obama administration. Gay marriage, Obamacare, the advent of the opioid crisis, and the advent of domestic terrorism, really. This has been very rapid change and without buy-in from the people that we were meeting on the trip. These areas hadn't recovered from the recessions of 1980, 1990, or 2001, let alone the Great Depression of 2008. They saw immigration and trade as taking away jobs, and steel industry and coal mines in Ohio being decimated. They hoped that Trump would carry through with some of the things he was talking about, though most realized that he might not. But they wanted a course change, and they were sure that Clinton would not give them one. They recognized Trump's flaws, but they thought he would produce change. It was resentment against change they couldn't control, I think, changes that would keep accelerating if Clinton were elected. Well, obviously, hearing from a few voters on a tour of Ohio really doesn't qualify as systematic evidence. But the pieces of those voters' minds raise question about some of the applicability of our usual explanations. Immigration, trade, racial prejudice, were they more racially prejudiced than they realized? Quite possibly. Are they afraid of becoming a minority in their own country, quote unquote? Were they unwilling to vote for a president who is female? Do they really believe in wild conspiracy theories? Or is it always the economy stupid? The loss of economic optimism, a feeling that a continuation of the status quo would not get them and their children what they deserve in economic terms. Indeed, resentment of changes more generally, anxious to get their country back. Well, with those thoughts, time for the papers themselves, and I think we start off this morning with Wendy Rahn and Lavine in a paper that fits quite well, actually, with the comments I've been making. And if people giving comments and Paul want to move up front, please feel free.
So am I here? Back here?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Eric. Nice to meet you. Yeah, looking forward to your comments.
You have a clicker as well.
Oh, okay.
Or
I
you
hate
can
those.
use
Yeah, I always screw those up. Well, good morning, everyone. I can't tell you how good it is to be back here and see some good friends and former colleagues and see how much Columbus has changed since I was here so long ago. So I want to thank Tom and Herb for inviting Howie and me to be here, to give me a chance to see my old stomping grounds again. I want to thank the Mershon Center for hosting us. And all the other paper givers, some great set of papers, very diverse. Stephen for his logistics support. And so I'm looking forward to a good couple days here. So I think, as Herb said, there are a number of themes he touched on in his remarks that actually kind of resonate with the paper that we wrote. And as has been discussed and very much interested, people are interested in populism. They sort of say Trump, Brexit, Le Pen, all in one breath. And so there's a lot of, I think, conceptual innovation going on in the study of populism, especially people who study populism in Western Europe and Latin America. So if you're not familiar with that work, I actually really encourage you to take a look at it. So here in the U.S., of course, we're no stranger to populism. We've had populism probably since the American Revolution in some ways was a populist movement. Most famously, of course, the People's Party and the populist movement of the late 19th century. And we start our paper off, actually with a quote from the Omaha Platform in 1892. As you can see here, there's a clear culprit that's being blamed for the people's misfortunes, and it's the two political parties. And so I'm going to hit on that theme as we go on. So Eric Oliver and I tried to get a handle on some of these theoretical and empirical issues in a paper we published last year in the Annals, and we came I think to a formulation that I actually like pretty well, which is that a populist moment is sort of this perfect storm of the right words, the right person, to the right people at the right time. And a number of papers here, we can think of actually those first two things as kind of the supply side of populism. Famous populists here, my favorite, Estes Kefauver, 1952, almost got the Democratic nomination. Some of the papers touch on cultural issues, racial resentment, sexism, some other predispositional variables like intuitionism. A couple of the papers actually try to dig in on this culture versus economics debate, which has been sort of ongoing since, for the last year. Howie and I have something, I think, to say about that that very much resonates with what Herb said, which is I think we're, for the most part, in the literature capturing economics incorrectly. We're using sort of the standard, are you better off than you were last year kinds of questions. And as Herb indicated, that's really not what's going on for people. I think it is this sort of pessimism that the American dream just isn't working anymore for a lot of people. And we incorporate that into some of our analyses, and I'll get also to that when I get to the results. But I think the most fundamental question is this last one, which is, why is now the right time? Why do we see this happening in the United States? Why did we get two such unusual candidates who were so popular with people? And the answer that Eric and I tried to provide, and that Howie and I also extend in our paper, is that populism emerges, this sort of perfect storm is created on the demand side when there are large numbers of people who no longer feel that the political system is responding to their needs. And we call that the representation gap. And we tried to measure Eric and I tried to measure the representation gap in the aggregate using some survey questions that have been asked at various times over the last more than quarter century. And we put together then this time series that's in the green that you can see there. And as you can see, it tracks pretty well with some of the standard A and ES questions, the trust in government questions. But we had a yearly time series because we were able to use Jim Stimson's method. And, this is a pretty interesting looking time series. You can see there's sort of two peaks, sort of Ross Perot era and the present moment. And, kind of what's moving this. And we looked at actually a lot of different things. Inequality's been mentioned, optimism about the economy, falling incomes, stagnating incomes, or weekly earnings, unemployment rate. You can see that these correlations are pretty small. Looking at, again, the partisan end, we looked at average party unity scores. That didn't do anything. But what really did pop out, and it's just like it's an extremely strong correlation, is with this measure of party conflict, which is the percentage of party unity votes that happen in Congress. And the correlation, as you can see, is in the time series is pretty strong. And so what Howie and I try to do in this paper is extend that concept of the representation gap, not looking at it not in the aggregate, but actually spatially. and setting it in the context of present-day polarization. So we've all seen the DW nominate graphs. We know that Congress is more polarized than it has ever been. Even, more polarized than in the late 19th century. And what that means is that there are a lot of people in the United States being represented by someone who is very spatially distant from them. So there's a lot of extremists in Congress, and because voters are generally centrists, even in districts that sort of skew one way or the other, it means that when they're represented by people who are at the ends of the ideological spectrum, there is in fact a large representation gap, and it's grown over time as Congress itself has become more polarized, and we get more and more of these folks at the ends of the ideological spectrum. And so we actually want to relate that kind of distance, that representation gap ideologically, to people's own subjective sense about how well they are represented. And the ANES in 2016 had a great question. It was asked in 2012 too, asking people, how good is your representative at keeping in touch with folks in the district? And so in our model, which you can kind of see graphically represented here in path analytic terms, we actually merge congressional district information with the ANES. We got members' scores on DW Nominate, and we took the absolute value as a measure of extremism. And what we discovered in our paper in the analyses is that member extremism is actually quite related to people's feelings that their member is not keeping in touch with the district. They like a member who's a co-partisan, but conditional on being a co-partisan, we do see this very strong extremism effect on people's subjective sense of being well represented. We in turn then relate extremism and this subjective representation gap to a variety of measures of political discontent, disapproval of Congress, which is a familiar variable, and then we also then constructed a populist attitude scale using some of the standard ANES items, as well as a number of great questions that were added to the 2016 ANES as part of the comparative studies of electoral systems. So we have a very nice scale in the paper. Some of the questions actually are very similar to the ones that Eric and I came up with when we did our primary survey. You'll be hearing more about that survey later. And then we related both member extremism and the subjective feelings of being unrepresented to those measures of discontent, and we found again that there are both direct and indirect effects of member extremism as well as substantial direct effects for the subjective sense that people aren't being represented. But of course the question is then how did it affect people's vote decisions, and so our final dependent variable in the paper is just comparative candidate evaluations, and we use these measures of discontent as well as a bunch of what we will call the deplorables hypothesis variables, to try to sort of calibrate how much of populism versus these sort of other explanations, these predispositional variables that people have been looking at. And, racial resentment, it's just clear, is just a really important variable in this election. It did carry the largest coefficient. In our final model, immigration also was important, but you can see here that the populist attitude scale actually did, is kind of comparable in size to the immigration question, and we even did, controlling for all of these things, we also did find a significant effect for disapproval of Congress. And getting back to kind of the demand side, what are people thinking about, this kind of American dream question that we had, which is a couple of questions that ANES included about, compared to 20 years ago, how easy is it for people to get ahead? The second question was about economic opportunity. So, the average American, so these are really sociotropic assessments of, the viability of the American dream. And we also find a significant effect then for that question, even with all these other things in there. And so I think I want to conclude by just saying that, the coalition that Trump put together was very broad. I mean, it's amazing how many things are significant in that final model. We've got party ID, we have ideology, we've got the deplorables variables, but we still see this effect for populism and political discontent, which in our earlier model showed was very much related to this subjective sense that the member is not doing a very good job keeping in touch with the district. So in terms of extensions, I think one of the things that, how am I doing on time, by the way?
12 minutes.
Oh, perfect. One of the things that Howie and I want to do is to try to replicate as much of this as possible in 2012 to see if, do we see these same kind of relationships, or was it in fact Trump's rhetoric, his populist rhetoric, that actually made people kind of consider how well they're being represented by the quote-unquote political establishment. So, sort of either way it turns out is sort of good. Either we see the same dynamic that extremism is affecting, congressional extremism is affecting people's sense that they're not being well represented, or we find, a kind of a priming effect that people were actually reconsidering how well the political system, and in particular their own member of Congress, was doing in meeting their needs. So I think I'll stop there. Howie, did you want to add anything that I missed?
Two things. One is there was no effect on comparative candidate evaluation, and almost for any other variable of egocentric financial worry. So there really was a distinction between sociotropic and egocentric economic items. And I should say that in most papers I've read, at least, the egocentric items appear as, the basis of economic discontent, and the usual conclusion is, oh, look, it's all culture, because the egocentric variable doesn't work. And the other thing is that we had a measure of authoritarianism, standard for the child-rearing variable, and that also failed in just about every analysis.
In fact, it was authoritarians like institutions, and they were more approving actually of Congress than non-authoritarians. So, the authoritarianism story for this election, I think, is maybe a lot more complicated than it's been made out to be, I think, in some of the literature. And again, there's just no denying that culture was important, but there are a lot of other things important as well. And I think actually that this sort of sense of being misrepresented may help us understand the geographic pattern of Trump's support. So that's another thing that we'll want to look at, is to see whether in these counties where Trump did so well, were some of them, I'm thinking in particular in rural areas. Rural areas often have very conservative members of Congress, but not everybody, even in Northwest Iowa, where I grew up, is a Republican, and so Democrats and independents in those rural districts are going to feel particularly not well represented by people like, Steve King, who is my member of Congress.
The last thing to say is that with respect to both the American dream, sociotropic economic variable, and the populist attitudes variable, neither were reducible to either the deplorables.
Yeah, not much going on there. Yeah, right. It is pretty distinct. Yeah, once in a while maybe immigration would pop out, but on a 0 to 1 scale, it's like its coefficient was like 0.04 or something like that. So again, sort of an aspect of, I think, Trump's surprising victory that hasn't gotten enough attention, certainly in the popular, among the chattering classes, but I think even in our own discipline, despite this long history of populism in the U.S., I think the story needs to come out a little bit more, and that it is related to something real, and that people have a good reason for not feeling well represented by the present state of the political system.
Hi, my name is Paul Becker, and I'm the unobtrusive chair of this panel, and hope to be very unobtrusive, but I just wanted to say a couple of things. First, each of the papers will have a discussant, and I think it makes the most sense to have the discussant discuss right after the paper is presented. I also will try to make sure that the trains run on time. Wish me good luck in that particular enterprise. But let me now turn to Eric Clark, who is a graduate student in our political science department here at Ohio State, who will serve as the discussant. I think we also will reserve some time after the discussion for some questions. But again, I'm going to ride herd on that because we want to make sure that we are able to keep on schedule as we proceed. Eric?
All right, so hello everyone. It's obviously a pleasure to be here, and I would be remiss if I did not start off this presentation by complimenting both this paper and this presentation. When preparing for this, I found myself writing down questions and then having to another paragraph in, cross them out because that was already answered. So I'll start with two, hopefully, kind of bigger picture questions. One in our kind of final model of looking at vote choice. I don't know why I have a problem saying that. Vote choice, it's based upon kind of a preference of, Trump or Clinton, a basic feeling thermometer, subtracted score. So I wanted to kind of, I suppose, ask you two, how do you think that would be, I want to broach the question of how do you think that would be different if, rather than doing it of kind of having one intra-party measure, we kind of separate this out by party. Since I know of looking at having two separate ones, it's a lot easier for the Democrats of doing Clinton versus Sanders than trying to figure out for the Republicans whether we want to go with Jeb or Rubio or that kind of stuff. So I think that is my question that I wanted your thoughts on of what do you think would be different if we did that? And then beyond that, I suppose I'll turn it over to, in a moment, I'll turn that over to you guys to ask that in discussion. But then the other question I had was specifically, and you mentioned this already, looking at kind of your economic pessimism. I really like that you guys separate out, you have your, as you say, sociotropic, the big picture, not yourself, but in the future, how do you think society is doing? And then you also include kind of your basic egocentric, your self-centered economic differences. And you find the effects in the sociotropic questions, but not really in the egocentric. So how does this fit in with kind of the really narrative of that it was kind of these poor rural whites that were a big driving force behind this election? Was this, who are economically disadvantaged? Do we think this is just a narrative? Do we think that this is, that's really simplifying how things ended up determining this election? Or, are they optimistic about themselves, not society? But so those were my main questions about this, and I suppose I'll turn this back to you to kick the discussion off between how do we think this would work intra-party, and how does this kind of fit in with this poor rural white narrative in terms of economic perceptions? So.
Thank you, Eric. And I may want to have Wendy come back up and field questions, or Howard can do that as well. But we'll spend a little bit of time on questions, and then we'll turn to the second paper. I'll go back to my unobtrusive role.
Should we address his questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You want to take the first, and I'll say
Yeah.
something about it too?
Yeah. So thanks, Eric, for those comments. In terms of the intra-party comparison, Eric and I did find actually that populist attitudes really distinguished Trump supporters from the other Republican supporters, if that, I think, was the basis for your question. Eric, I think, is going to have a lot more to say about the primaries, so I'll just maybe let him tell you about that. But the other thing, actually, that I was doing yesterday on the plane was actually trying to look at this subjective representation gap by party. That is, do Republicans and Democrats versus independents think about this extremism and having a member that's way far away from them? Do they think about it differently? And there's actually some really interesting asymmetry. This is actually something that Shanto Iyengar and some other people are starting to show too, which is that when people are represented by a co-partisan, they don't care how extreme that person is. But when they are represented by the out party, they really care a lot about that member's ideological extremism. And of course, independents, they just don't like it, they don't like extremism of either stripe. So there is this really interesting partisan asymmetry where people seem to be thinking spatially if they're represented by someone from the opposite party, but they don't really care if they have when it's a fellow traveler. So trying to think a little bit more about the nature of that asymmetry and maybe tie that into some of the things that we know about expressive partisanship and what's going on with mass partisans, I think, is something that we'll want to explore further.
Can I ask a question, if anybody knows the answer? In how many states, or is it the case in a certain number of states that non-Republicans can vote in Republican primaries?
We just have to declare our partisan when we ask for the ballot in Ohio.
Okay, so let's say that the number of non-Republicans, independents, and even Democrats might vote. So in that case, given what Wendy said about Shanto's work, I think Trump would be quite attractive within the dynamics of our model, right? So a lot of independents and Democrats are going to be less extreme. They probably, felt like, at least in the economic domain, that Trump was a better fit. And the other thing I would say is that voters, and this sort of blends a dispositional approach with sort of elite rhetoric, and that is that voters that crave order, certainty, and security that are, in a sense, closed, and who are also unengaged in politics or low in education, which was Trump's sort of classic kind of blend of his positions, tend to be economically liberal and moderate. And Trump was a strongly divergent candidate in that field of 17 other relatively establishment or oriented economic conservatives. So I think from those two perspectives I think our model would work from those two features.
Did you want to say something about the economics point?
I was writing something else down, so I missed it. But if you start, I'll pick it up. Go ahead.
Well, I think the narrative is correct. In other words, I think as Herb's journey in those three counties suggests, is that there are people who live in places where there is downward mobility. And it's, their young people are leaving. I know that's a concern in a lot of rural areas. But if you actually look at the county level in terms of Trump's support, at the county level, it's correlated with all kinds of kind of social dysfunction, and those areas tend to have lower workforce participation, more of the opioid epidemic, more jobs lost to Chinese import competition. And so there really was something going on economically in the election. And I think our particular way of sort of tapping this sociotropic sense that the American dream is no longer working is actually maps on pretty well, I think, to some of the things that we know are going on in those places.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that people who live in small towns, people without college educations, tend to be more social capital dependent and oriented.
Right.
And I think Trump spoke to that quite well, and that would also suggest that the sociotropic measures might work especially well within a Republican primary.
Nice.
So I had a question about the pool of issues that people are considering when they compare themselves to a representative, right? So you obviously have evidence that the subjective gap is rather large, and you know what the positions of the representatives are, but how stable are the preferences of the voters, and what pool of preferences are they using in making that subjective evaluation?
Yeah.
To me, right, the interesting thing would be for policy, but I just wonder in general if we had any evidence or anything to say about that.
About the stability of voters' preferences vis-a-vis constructing a measure that would include?
Yeah, some sort of objective
Distance.
distance
Yeah.
that includes the voters'
Yes.
stable preferences, and the pool, because presumably they can't be comparing along every issue position, right? So
Right.
I'm wondering what that pool consists of.
Well, this measure of extremism isn't ideal, precisely because it doesn't incorporate the voter. But we confront this problem known as the common space problem. And people use the CCES because it has specific roll calls, and they can scale people on those roll calls, and then they can look at the members' roll calls and then actually then construct the distance. We're trying to figure out a way to do that in the context of ANES, because the CCES doesn't have good political discontent measures. It doesn't have anything that resembles our subjective representation gap question. We did try actually two different, one is we used people's ideological, symbolic ideology and constructed a distance measure based on that. And we also just kind of scaled some scope of government questions and used that, which is like, it's correlated like 0.7 with ideology. But again, voters are responding to the ANES questions, and members, ideology is constructed from these roll calls. And so even though we can construct this distance, it's not really clear what it means. I would say, though, that even kind of with those problems, when we did construct the distance measure using ideological self-identification, that member extremism obviously is the biggest input into that distance. And if we use that distance instead of member extremism, because it incorporates the voter's subjective sense, actually the effect is a little bit bigger than extremism. It's like, so extremism, I think the effect size was 0.1, and with this kind of distance measure, it was like 0.15. But I mean, obviously, if we could get this distance measure right, it might even be bigger than that. So we're working on that. It's imperfect right now in the paper, admittedly.
Can I jump in real quickly just to answer that, and Rick and Diana have questions, and a question over here. I mean, I think you have to acknowledge, in this kind of analysis, that voters' preferences are going to be pretty strongly endogenous to their feelings about the candidates and parties. And so that's something that we have to grapple with more. And the other thing, more conceptually, is that I say that, in the perception of voters about where their members stand, it's probably, I'm guessing the process is either that they're thinking about one salient issue, whatever that is at the moment, or the general sense that, the member is sort of a hard line, like a Freedom Caucus kind of person, or someone whose rhetoric is somewhat more moderate, and that it might not focus so much on issues. I think we're thinking that issues are just less and less important each paper that we read. And
there are other ways maybe to think about member ideology or members' political preferences, not using DW Nominate. You could actually do content analysis of newsletters and campaign content, campaign ads, to kind of get a sense of how extreme the person sounds. And do that more qualitatively instead of rely. I mean, we use DW Nominate because it's there, and everybody uses it. And in studies of congressional vote choice, people use DW Nominate to look at spatial distance. So we use that for now.
Paul, do we have time for? Yeah. Diana, and then say here. Rick.
I'm wondering, it struck me that if you're thinking about this at the level of congressional representation, and given the number of heavily lopsided, majorly gerrymandered districts, you would think more people are represented by a co-partisan, which tends to make them happier, you say.
Right.
So I know you don't have that particular measure over time, but wouldn't you think people would be more happy by based on a subjective representation measure, if that's what's really going on? Because of the gerrymandering of districts means more people get to live their district where their party wins.
Right.
And then the second thing I wondered about, with the subjective representation measures, is it explicitly asking about the member of Congress?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I worry a lot because I know how few people actually know who their member of Congress is, let alone where they stand on issues and so forth, about it actually representing extremism in terms of policies and so forth.
Well, yeah, you'd think that, but then why does it work? I mean, clearly people are picking this up somehow. I mean, admittedly, there is a little bit more missing data on the subjective representation question, so some people aren't answering it, but people who do answer it seem to be picking up something, right, about how well this person is doing representing them, and it turns out that they don't like a person when that person is too far to one side or the other. To your point about increasingly lopsided districts, I mean, it's a good point, but of course many of those districts still have independents in them, right? So independents are going to be more bummed out, right, than they would have been, say, 10 years ago when people were less extreme. And there'll be out partisans too. So again, I'm going back to these rural areas where a lot of members of Congress are pretty extremely conservative, but Democrats and independents in those places are not very well represented. And of course, Republicans in cities are also not very well represented, in urban areas, because most of the Democrats are like Barbara Lee are pretty extreme. So it could be that co-partisans are more happy, but out-partisans and independents are less happy. So how that nets out, I still think that there are going to be more people unhappy now than, say, 15 years ago when people weren't as extreme.
You could test that directly, right? Because you can merge every ANES survey to the congressional data.
Right.
And then you could see whether there's been any net change in this over time, in addition to looking at the specific question about representation from 2012, right? Because that's my issue with a lot of the bad commentary about the election, is that there's never any comparison to a previous election, right? So,
Well, I said we're going to look at 2012.
See, this is just me soapboxing for a minute.
And 1892 as well.
Exactly. So in the 1892 NES, I bet you can.
We compare it to the 1888
But to me, this is one of the challenges for a lot of the election-specific explanations, is that, like, if you go back to 2012, every indicator that was supposed to indicate voter anger wasn't any different in 2012 than it was in 2016. And yet, if actually economic evaluations were more pessimistic in 2012 than 2016. So yeah.
Not the American, I mean, that's the problem with using those those typical the egocentric.
Consumer sentiment data is not just, it's a combination of things, right? It's 4 different questions, 5 different questions. I don't know.
Well,
anyway, so the question for me, the really interesting thing would be, is there something, kind of like in the first graph that you and Eric put together, is there really something that's transforming people's views of representation over time that gives us the potential for, I mean, it doesn't necessarily explain why you get a candidate like Trump in a particular year, there's too much idiosyncrasy there, but it would definitely suggest like there's fertile soil here that didn't used to be more as fertile in 1970 or something to that effect.
Well, actually, you could argue that sort of 68, 72 was a kind of another populist moment, but there the problem is not too much partisanship, but too little partisanship. In other words, I think that there's sort of like this Goldilocks point in terms of partisanship and representation. So, in the late 60s and 70s, the parties, they were, Humphrey and Nixon didn't take different positions on, and so there's not enough partisanship to structure people's choices, but now there's too much partisanship. And so, there's some sort of happy medium where the parties sort of get it right. And I think right now it's hard to imagine sort of escaping the polarized moment because the parties are in such fierce competition for national majority control. This is Francis Lee's new book. And so there's all kinds of incentives for members to make, she documents how, in terms of the communications staff and all these, people are sending out messages. This is why I want to look at messages, not just DW nominate, to see if we can act, because this is what, if voters are going to pick up something, they're not going to look at DW nominate, but they will hear words, they'll develop some intuitive sense, right, that this person isn't representing me well, I think.
And Chanto's point about asymmetry, about co-partisans not minding really extreme representatives, might have not been the case until maybe post-94 at some point.
But the Jacobson-type graphs would suggest Diana's point, which is that congressional districts measured by presidential vote have become more lopsided over time. People are better sorted now in the sense that it's less likely that they're going to be represented by a person who is opposite the partisanship of the district measured by the presidential vote. I don't see how there's any way it can't net out that more people are represented by a co-partisan representative who is therefore presumably okay for them, right? So just in terms of the sheer numbers, right? Like people should be better represented now, which is an unfortunate consequence of some of the partisan trends. Seems like that should be true.
Yeah, that's what it does.
Again, though, what about all the independents?
There are fewer independents than there used to be, so there's less.
But independence is rising. It's reversing, and
they're not pure independence, not really, right?
Yeah. Also, they can't vote they don't vote as often in congressional elections just because they're not, hardcore.
Well, notwithstanding Chanto's point, it's also quite possible that they're just members are outpacing the ideological preferences, even if they're very, very fuzzy. So that would counteract.
I think to keep the trains running on
yeah,
time, we should cut this short, unfortunately. There's, I think, a lot of hands in the air, and move on to the second paper. And then if we have time after the second paper and its discussion, we can come back to this. So remember,
there's lunch too.
And there is lunch.
Coffee break, great.
Okay, let me just very briefly introduce the second paper. It's by Chris Gelpi and Elias. And Elias, I think that you're going to present, because Chris is unfortunately out of town. So go right ahead.
Thank you. Yep. Let's do. Great. And then we're gonna view full screen so that I can hit next. Full screen.
And you can use this or the arrows, whatever you want to do.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Okay, so unfortunately, Chris couldn't be here today, but I'm going to go ahead and give the presentation. I'm very happy to be talking to you today, and thank you for showing up this morning. So Chris is foreign policy, political science here at OSU, and so I study foreign policy as well, and we wanted to see what the role of foreign policy might have been during the 2016 presidential election. I'm going to start you off with three quotes here that kind of got us thinking about how this is a different election. During the 2016 primary, we started to see these new positions that really hadn't been taken by either side before, and for us as students of foreign policy were very interesting. So the first one here is kind of mainstream. I've been doing deals for a long time. I've been making lots of wonderful deals, great deals. That's what I do. Never ever in my life have I seen a transaction as incompetently negotiated as the deal with Iran. So that's the Iran nuclear deal. And all three positions are about nuclear weapons. The first one is fairly generic, right? This makes sense. It's a Republican position that the Iran nuclear deal was poorly executed. It's not good for the United States. We should renegotiate it or negotiate a new deal in parallel. That wasn't very surprising to us. That's the kind of thing that we would expect to see in the media during Republican primary at this time. But the second really kind of set off our radar. This is a little bit unusual. Now, wouldn't you rather, in a certain sense, have Japan have nuclear weapons when North Korea has nuclear weapons? Maybe it's going to have to be China change because so many people, you have Pakistan has it, you have China has it, you have so many other countries are now having it. So this quote came out, and this kind of rhetoric was being circulated during primary. It's a very different position from what both the left
and the right have advocated, which is the norm of nuclear non-proliferation. So that's the idea that existing stockpiles should be reduced and that new countries should not acquire the bomb. Now this position, whether you agree with it or not, is basically founded on the idea that we can reduce the American security umbrella by allowing some of our allies to gain nuclear weapons so they can presumably deter on their own, and so it might save the U.S. money. But really, the policy itself isn't as interesting as the fact that no presidential candidate has really broken this norm before. And then the third is even stronger than the norm. It's actually the nuclear taboo. So this quote is from an interview. Someone hits us with an ISIS, wouldn't you want to fight back with a nuke? So that goes against what we call the nuclear taboo against first use. So the idea that the United States should not be the first to use a nuclear weapon. We shouldn't really talk about that in our kind of presidential rhetoric. And considering using a nuclear weapon against a non-state actor is also considered taboo. And again, this is a position that the left and the right have been united upon for a long time. So we thought, maybe voters will react negatively to this. We know that a majority of the public doesn't agree with these positions, but obviously these quotes you probably have guessed are from Donald Trump, who went on after that to become the 45th president of the United States. So we're really puzzled as we were kind of studying foreign policy at the time, why did Donald Trump win despite making so many unpopular or taboo foreign policy statements? Is it possible that these statements cost him votes, at least with people who mark foreign policy as the most important issue to them? Did they mobilize the opposition, or did something else entirely happen? So we're going to view the election through the lens of foreign policy through these three competing paradigms or theories about how you might be able to win the vote, right? The first is issue position. So basically I have an issue or a set of issues that I really care about as a voter, and I'm going to go out and find the person who best represents me along these lines. That's very direct. So that's one possibility. The second is persuasion. So I already like Donald Trump because of his domestic politics, or I like his identity as a Washington outsider. There's something about him that's kind of won me over, and so I'm going to be persuaded to adopt his foreign policy positions because I don't really care about foreign policy possibly, or I don't think about it too much, and I believe that this politician has my best interest in mind, so I'm going to adopt that stance. And the third is party loyalty. So this is political polarization, in-group versus out-group. It's the idea that since I want to win the White House, I want to win that Supreme Court nomination, it's more important that the Republican Party win than my issue be represented directly. So even if I disagree about how nuclear weapons should be used or circulated, I'm going to go ahead and vote for the in-group rather than the out-group. So we studied this using a survey. This is a survey that we fielded on Qualtrics, and this is just the flow chart of how you proceed through the survey. I'm going to walk you through briefly. So first our respondents consent, and they give us various demographics, things like age, sex, etc. Then various independent variables are measured, so we want to get their political orientation, whether they're a foreign policy hawk or a dove, their leading foreign policy interests in terms of what positions they follow closely and care about, and domestic positions as well. And then we're going to randomly assign them to one of several treatments. So sometimes you'll get Donald Trump as the kind of featured person in the news article, and he's going to give one of three cues, three things that were circulated that week leading up to the election, kind of moving from green, which is the acceptable nuclear position, to yellow and red, which is breaking that nuclear taboo against first use of nuclear weapons. And sometimes, rather than receive those cues from Donald Trump, you're going to get them from this candidate over here, who we actually made up for the study. His name is Paul Evans. He's a fictitious candidate for Senate. And the reason we did that is we wanted to see what the effect was, kind of stripping away all the considerations that come with Donald Trump and just presenting these same issue positions through the lens of somebody who is just a Republican. That's all you get. That's all the information. So kind of a representation of mainstream Republican candidate. We're then going to measure various dependent variables. So who are you going to vote for? Are you going to come out to vote this week? And finally, we're going to debrief them and let them go. The newspaper articles look something like this. So here's Donald Trump, and then you get the quote inside of this edited New York Times article in this case. Sometimes the same cue comes from Paul Evans, who again, all you know is that he's running for Senate and he's a Republican. We fielded this again, the week leading up to the election with 1,568 people on Qualtrics. These are various variables that we collected, things like ideology, education, whether or not they're unemployed, level of political knowledge. I'm just showing you here that randomization along both the Paul Evans and Donald Trump treatment groups was fine, and then also along Iran deal, nuclear proliferation, and striking ISIS, which are the three quotes that I gave you, the three newspaper articles they're going to read. And I'll come back to a model in the end that actually uses these variables, but for now I'm just going to show you some crosstabs and take a look at the results. So to begin, we wanted to see what would happen to vote choice. The way to read this is that Paul Evans, our fictitious candidate, is at the top, and then Donald Trump is at the bottom, and the columns are the three issues, right? So for Evans, he loses. He loses the election badly, right? When we move from Evans giving a cue about the Iran nuclear deal, 35% yeses, to a drop, a significant statistically drop, 22% yeses. Yes, I'm going to vote for him when he talks about nuclear proliferation. Similarly, a very sharp decline when he says that we should consider striking ISIS with a nuclear bomb. So it seems like the issue position here is having an effect on our generic Republican that you know nothing about. But when we look at Donald Trump, he actually gains some votes. Statistically, this is a flat line, but there's no kind of electoral punishment going on. The voters don't refrain from voting for him. In fact, there's a little bit of an increase. And if you look at vote turnout, it's the same story. So people are less likely to come out to vote for Paul Evans this week. They are just as likely as ever to vote for Donald Trump. And so we're really wondering what is going on. It can't, it seems, be issue position alone, right? Because we presented the same position from two different mouths, two different candidates, and got drastically different results. One candidate was punished severely, the other one remains unscathed. And so what are the voters doing? Could it be possible that the voters are persuaded by Donald Trump to adopt these issue positions because they don't really care about foreign policy, they care about domestic politics, they care about other considerations that come into voting for Donald Trump, and so Donald Trump is changing minds. But we don't think this is the case. So what you can see here is that neither candidate is successfully shifting anyone's mind on the nuclear taboo. The literature on the nuclear taboo is pretty clear. Those who hold this idea are pretty stable in it. They don't change their minds in response to just a short manipulation like this. So no one's moving. Similarly, when we do mediation analyses on the softer issue of the Iran nuclear deal or nuclear nonproliferation and nuclear weapon use at the bottom here, I'm happy to get into this in detail in the Q&A, but basically what it shows you is that Donald Trump is not changing voters' minds and then gaining votes because of that. It's not the situation.
He's changing minds on nuclear nonproliferation.
Yes, he is, sorry. He is changing minds on nuclear nonproliferation. It's not a very large shift in the sample, but definitely not nuclear weapon use. The third thing that we tested for is there's no Trump effect in terms of which newspaper article you have. So if there's a dummy variable that shows you whether Donald Trump is the speaker in the random assignment or Paul Evans, there's no difference when Donald Trump is the speaker. He's no better at changing minds in these three manipulations. So we don't think it's persuasion because both men are equally persuasive. That is to say, they're weakly persuasive. There's a little bit of shift, as you noted, but it's not large. And so we don't think that Donald Trump is persuading people to abandon the nuclear taboo. And so we investigate if this is party loyalty. This is the regression. I can get into this in a moment. During the Q&A, we can go through all the manipulations that we have here and the various demographic variables that I showed you at the beginning. But I kind of want to skip to the top here and show you what we found most interesting. So zooming in, ideology is measuring left to right scale, right? So the more conservative you are, the more likely you are to vote Evans. That makes sense because all we told you about Evans is that he's a Republican. And also the more ideologically to the right you are, the more likely you are to vote for Donald Trump. Now, having controlled for that, simply labeling yourself as a Republican in our survey, so answering yes, I am a Republican, is no more likely to make you vote for Evans. So there's no effect there for taking on that level. But interestingly, controlling for ideology and everything else, saying yes, I'm a Republican, is the most significant indicator for voting for Donald Trump in our sample. Looking at that visually, statistically, this is a flat line for Evans, but controlling again for ideology, controlling for issue positions domestically and foreign policy-wise, the largest predictor is labeling yourself yes, a Republican for voting for Trump. So we think it's mostly party loyalty plus something else. Donald Trump talked about draining the swamp during the primary, and still does so. It's a big part of the narrative. It's, he's a Washington outsider, and he wants to come in and change things up. And a part of that is punishing the political establishment, right? So we see in this cartoon kind of Hillary Clinton being drained from the swamp, globalism on the post there. Donald Trump is not saying I want to rehabilitate these politicians or I want to try again, but rather I'm going to come in, shake things up, and drain the swamp. And this activates voters, specifically retributive voters. So we see here are voters who are higher on the retributive orientation scale. What that basically means is they are more, in terms of psychological trait, willing to punish rather than rehabilitate somebody who they've seen as doing wrong. So they believe essentially that, in this case, the Washington establishment has let them down, they've failed them repeatedly over time, and now they want to punish it by draining the swamp. And that's basically encapsulated in this graph, which shows you the entire paper kind of in one presentation. We see perfect political polarization, so controlling for ideology and everything else. We have Republicans at that ceiling effect, 75% at the top, so they're going to vote for Donald Trump no matter what. Democrats all the way at the floor here, they're definitely not going to vote for Donald Trump. And the people who do move are independents in the sample, and independents are moving pretty directly with retributive orientation on that 0 to 1 scale. So the people who are least willing to punish the political establishment look a lot like Democrats, and people who are most eager to punish the political establishment are looking a lot like Republicans. They are flipping and voting for Trump. There is no effect like that for Evans. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because Paul Evans, all you know about him is that he's a Republican. There's not that same narrative. It's not activating the same considerations. He is a representation of the establishment, the best representation we could come up with of simply the Republican label. And so in the end, we think that the reason that Donald Trump didn't suffer the same foreign policy associated costs that Paul Evans did in our sample is because first, there was high party loyalty that made those issues less of a consideration in deciding who you're going to vote for. So we want to win that Supreme Court nomination, and the presidency is much more important. And importantly also, we don't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. And number two, for independents who are not part of this polarization, don't identify with either group, those who are more willing to punish the political establishment are, in our findings, much more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Thank you very much, and we want to thank Decision Sciences too for funding our research here at OSU.
Okay, next we're going to turn to Jack Kinsett, graduate student from political science, who will spend about 5 minutes discussing.
Yeah, thank you. So I thought this was an awesome paper, and I want to just recapitulate the findings sort of in a streamlined manner. So first is just the finding, sort of the descriptive finding that people don't punish Donald Trump in the experiment, but punish the hypothetical candidate Paul Evans. And I think it was almost short-sold. I think that's a big finding, just to sort of, we have this anecdotal evidence, this journalistic account that Donald Trump isn't being punished by voters for making these sort of extreme statements and taking extreme issue positions on at least nuclear weapons. So I want to commend just sort of presenting this journalistic account and showing that it is in fact somewhat truer in an experimental sense. And then the second sort of major finding is that the reason why Trump is sort of impervious to the negative effects of making these unorthodox statements is just part of polarization. So Republicans are sticking with their party even though Trump is making these statements, which means that Trump is not effectively persuading voters, and that voters actually do care about this issue a little bit. This isn't just a story of voters don't care about the issues at all, so they're going to sort of stick to party. It's even when they do care about issues, they're going to stick with their party, which I think is important. And then the last one is that retributive orientation strongly predicts independent voting for Donald Trump in the model. So sort of to start off and kick off our discussion, I have a few comments and questions. So first, I think it was an interesting experimental setup, just in the sense that you had both a real political candidate, perhaps the most salient political candidate of all time. Donald Trump got coverage in the news 24/7, whereas Paul Evans is clearly this just hypothetical candidate. So I think it was important that you had both of them, and of course, that's sort of taken for granted. But I'm imagining a study could have been done with just Paul Evans, and the finding would have been that people care about issue positions and change their vote choice based on the issues that candidates take. So just sort of another commending note that I could see this being a simpler experiment and you finding something completely different. So I think it was important to have both Trump and Evans there. And sort of something to think about is how that influenced, how that design influenced the findings. The major question I have is, so retributive orientation is affecting independents in your finding. Do you think it affected Republican primary voters? So obviously Republican primary voters, the party loyalty explanation really can't account for Trump winning the primary. Do you think retributive orientation sort of steps in there similarly to how it does for independents? The second major question I have is that was a huge effect, retributive orientation onto independent vote choice for Trump. What do you think that might be? So I'm just a little bit unfamiliar with the scale, but it sort of sounds like a lot of other things that I know more about. So I'm not sure what sort of variables you also got in your model, but does that sort of link up with populism? Does that link up with racial resentment? Sort of once you include more of those variables, I'd be curious what you would find. And then the last note I have is, do you think this is candidate specific, or do you think this would happen to pretty much every real candidate in a highly polarized system? So for instance, if it was Paul Ryan versus Paul Evans, do you think you would find the same sort of party loyalty effect? Or is it just that people are loyal to Donald Trump? And then, so sort of something that's slightly sort of related to that, is it candidate specific, or is it level of race specific? So it could just be that he's the presidential nominee. So basically, if you had other presidential nominees, do you think you would find the same stuff? But I think that's sort of all I have to kick off discussion. That's useful.
Okay, thank you, John. Elias, why don't you go back up? You could, if you want to respond first to the points that John made, then we'll just throw things open.
Yeah, I think I will. It's louder than I remember. So first, so I'll take these actually in reverse order. I found the third point really interesting. Is it the level of race? Is it the presidency that's doing this, or would we see this? Yeah, I mean, we have no evidence about that, and I would be really interested in finding out. I can't answer your question of, do we think this loyalty would only translate to Donald Trump as the candidate? I don't think so. I don't think there's anything unique about him that's activating that. But what I would say is that it's probably a dislike of Hillary Clinton, distrust of Hillary Clinton, right? So that the kind of contra-partisan cue there. But no, I would expect that it is probably tied to the level of race, so that's very interesting. In terms of your second question, so what is this correlated with? We had social dominance orientation, and it's not highly correlated. It's not importantly highly correlated with party identification, which a lot of other things are. We also had authoritarianism, which I think in the model was collinear at like 0.4 level with party identification, but only at like 0.1 with retributive orientation. So actually we think we found hopefully like a unique dimension there. And your first question, did retributive orientation affect Republicans? It did not, at least not as far as we can tell in the sample. Yeah, and I think part of that is that there was a ceiling effect there, so there wasn't a lot of room for movement. These are great comments. Thank you very much. Yes?
So I have the benefit of having your monkey cage post
Right.
this experiment in front of me. And I think there's a little nuance that I want to add to the way that you presented the results. based
Sure.
on what you presented there. The fact that Trump was able to persuade people on the Iran nuclear deal, that's a 9-point increase in support of independence and a 17-point increase in opposition to the Iran nuclear deal among Republicans as a result of seeing Trump's anti-nuclear deal message.
Okay.
To me, I think part of what you guys said in the piece, which I think probably can emerge, is that Trump can move opinion. And he moved opinion on the nuclear deal, he moved opinion on trade, Republican views of free trade got significantly worse during the campaign. Republican views of Putin got significantly better. Republican views of WikiLeaks also got better. Not that favorable, but still better, right? So he's moving opinion. But the question is, where can he move opinion and where can he not?
Right.
So to me, the interesting thing in y'all's results is that he can sort of move opinion on an issue where there's probably already sort of fertile soil in the party not to like the Iran nuclear deal because it's already been criticized by a number of Republican politicians anyway. But on this other stuff, which voters probably haven't thought a lot about, but nuclear weapons, there might be more predisposition, no, yuck, right? And he's like, oh, sure, maybe. And then they're like, no, thanks, actually.
Right.
Even when they get that message. So I would think an interesting extension of the project would be to really think about, with regard to foreign policy, how far will people follow leaders? There's a real fear that they'll follow him pretty far, given things that he's done as president.
Right.
Are there any guardrails in public opinion? So I think you guys can, even some new experimentation would be really useful in this regard. I was also fascinated by the retribution finding.
Yes.
And to me, what would really make that stand out would be to do a survey now, ask that battery of questions. In addition, not only to people's evaluations of Trump, but ask them a battery of questions about their evaluations of a bunch of other political figures. I'll show a graph later that that's where you can see that white identity stands out as a predictor of support for Trump and not a predictor of support for other kinds of candidates, including more Republican politicians or Democratic politicians.
Right.
And so to me, that would really make clear whether this retribution thing is really a story about Trump or it's a story about lots of politicians of a particular ilk.
Okay.
Right? So ask it of Chris Christie. Right? I don't know how many people have a good view of Chris Christie right now, or have an attitude towards Chris Christie. But there's another guy who sort of traffics in this kind of pugilistic way of thinking about the world. Right? So if you're oriented towards retribution, Chris Christie sounds like a guy you should support. But Jeb Bush, low energy Jeb, right? So where's the fire in the belly for retribution in Jeb?
Right.
That doesn't really exist.
Right.
Quite the same way. So I think that's a really neat extension. Because in some sense, you've got a bunch of placebo tests there.
Yep.
Right, where you wouldn't expect it to matter as much as it matters for Trump, and you could see if in fact that's the case. Because it wouldn't surprise me if it has a distinctive relationship with Trump. But we can't know just from one study on one candidate, right? The comparisons would be really instructive.
Thank you. That's great. Yes.
One piece of evidence you presented that I think might suggest this is that Paul Evans takes the same anti-establishment issue positions as Trump, and the retribution scale doesn't seem to be tapping into the drain the swamp
That's true.
ethic for him. So I was wondering, so John mentioned populism as a possible thing that he's tapping into, and I just wanted to see if you can tease that out a little bit more, because in the presentation, I'm not sure I saw the link between the retribution scale and necessarily drain the swamp, or a sort of broader populist tone of, I'm taking this idiosyncratic position that the establishment member of my party might not be expected to take.
Yeah, and we don't actually have a measure of that, so I don't know if we can do that with this project, but yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Maybe I could ask a question of you about the suggestion that you made, because this is a very interesting suggestion to look at multiple political figures. So perhaps I can ask you about that later. I think I definitely want to follow.
Yeah, it may make sense to have all three of the people presenters come up front, and then questions could be asked one or the other, depending upon those questions you have stored up from Wendy and Howard.
If I remember right, both John Mueller at one end of the room and